Good evening. Welcome to Dukakis Live. I'm David Wisner, Professor of International Relations at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki, and Executive Director of the Michael and Kitty Dukakis Center for Public and Humanitarian Service. We're launching this evening in collaboration with my very dear friend Pendalis Savvidis, a monthly series of programs in English on current affairs, on issues particularly of interest to an anglophone Greek audience throughout Greece. Pendalis Savvidis and I, incidentally, have been collaborating together in one way or another for close to 2 decades and perhaps even more. I recall quite fondly the first time I appeared with Pendalis on his old Anik Nefsi's television program on Eritrea back in May of 2011. And that was the launch of a very fruitful collaboration between the two of us. And I just want to acknowledge the place he has among faculty at universities and among local journalists as the dean of the journalistic profession here in Thessaloniki. Our guest today is another old friend. We happen to be neighbors, sometime neighbors in Panorama, a suburb of Thessaloniki. James Wasserstrom is a diplomat and a public official. He had a long affiliation with the United Nations, including a storied and rather adventurous stint as an anti-corruption expert at the United Nations mission in Kosovo. From 2009 to 2014, Jim worked in and on Afghanistan, largely at the behest of the US government, for USAID, for the Department of State, for the Department of the Army. He spent some time at the front lines in the early days of the so-called surge under the Obama administration in 2009. He then worked on a variety of anti-corruption projects at the US Embassy in Kabul. He'll tell us more about that as the program ensues. And then he was a part of a team working at the behest of the US Department of Army on lessons learned, what transpired as the US was seeking to reconstruct Afghanistan after the long military campaign there. And this would be a report that eventually made its way into major US newspapers and caused a bit of a stir because there was some question about really what transpired and what lessons were learned. I would say that knowledgeable sources inform me that Jim's contribution was really at the heart of this paper, and it's the definitive statement, so to speak, on what transpired during the US occupation in Afghanistan. More recently, Jim had done a little bit of work for civil society in Afghanistan before moving on to places such as Ukraine. He happened to be working for the Ukraine government at the time that Rudy Giuliani was looking for incriminating evidence against Hunter Biden, the son of the current president of the United States, Joe Biden. If you are familiar with Jim's work, you will understand that he's been somewhat critical of the Biden administration for the withdrawal of troops most recently from Afghanistan. And it's extremely interesting reading if you want to look at his social media posts, because it's extremely clear on the one hand, but it's also pointed in the criticism that he makes of the administration. Hopefully we'll get to some more of that as the program ensues. Well, I want to welcome you, Jim, and I want to thank you for joining us on the program. And maybe you could give us, by way of introduction, a sense of how you got involved in Afghanistan in 2009.
Sure. Thank you, David. Thank you for having me on the program. I actually joined the U.S. government to work in Afghanistan in 2009 after I got fired by the UN for being a whistleblower on corruption in the UN mission in Kosovo, which involved the senior UN officials and Kosovar government officials that were trying to collect a $500 million kickback on a $5 billion contract. And the UN is very unfriendly to whistleblowers and also to the fight against internal corruption. So I paid the price for that. That's a different story. But after I was basically put out on the street for my whistleblowing, I saw that the incoming president, Obama, was planning to send lots of civilians to do a kind of hearts and minds program in Afghanistan, in rural areas in particular, but also in the capital city. And given my background in development, economic and political development, which I had done for many years in the UN system, I applied and was taken very quickly. Had to go through of course I had to get my top secret clearance, which took some time, but I also had to go through quite a bit of training in counterintelligence work, counterterrorism, handling weapons, being able to defend myself physically, driving, evasive driving, all that kind of training. And then we were all sent off to Afghanistan without knowing at all what we would be doing. So in my case, I landed in Kabul, had a couple of days there, and then they sent me, as you mentioned, right to the Pakistan border at a U.S. military base, where I was advising the commander, a colonel in charge of that base, on how to win Afghan hearts and minds to support the U.S. effort there and to support the relatively new Afghan government. So that's how I got there. But very soon after I got there, a few months, and that zone where I was in Nangarhar. That's one of the most violent areas traditionally in this war. And I covered 4 very violent provinces, and there were other Americans in those provinces, and they worked with me and for me. And so we worked with villagers and with provincial authorities and so on. But soon after I got there, the embassy in Kabul, the State Department, realized that there was a problem with corruption. They didn't understand the scope of it, and that I had done 7 years of anti-corruption work with the UN in Kosovo, which is how I blew the whistle on my colleagues because part of my job. And I had some expertise working in conflict zones against corruption. So they pulled me out of the work I was doing at the front and brought me up to Kabul to be the first and the only permanent expert on anti-corruption to be stationed at the embassy during the entire war. And I spent 5 years as the senior advisor to the 22 ambassadors with whom I served, the generals in the military and elsewhere in the embassy. At the same time, I had 2 roles. My other role, so the first role was political, and the second role was more providing assistance to Afghan NGOs that were fighting corruption and to the Afghan government as it was trying to fight corruption. So I had both a political advisory role as well as a funding development programs to counter corruption. So that's how I found my way into corruption in Afghanistan.
Let me interject here. Was this something that was unique to the Obama administration as compared to what was transpiring in Afghanistan under the administration of George W. Bush? Was there a new emphasis here?
There was. I think what had happened was that the situation with respect to corruption had begun to emerge in a very violent way, and nobody really wanted to acknowledge the extent of the problem, and the Bush administration kept it essentially hidden. But it was so obvious by the time Obama was elected that they had to do something, and they had no plan for what to do. It just happened by pure coincidence that I happened to arrive there for a completely different role, and they pulled me out and put me in as the only person involved in the fight against corruption with any expertise. There were other people who joined me, but they had no background in the subject matter. They were very helpful, but they were not experts, and they didn't really know what to do. But it was shocking for me that after 7 years or 8 years of the war, and with the situation of corruption that was completely out of control and in the hundreds of millions and eventually billions of dollars that were being siphoned off, that there was no expertise, that it was me in the beginning and a few other people eventually. So I think it spoke volumes for how completely over their heads the U.S. government was when it came to acknowledging and confronting the problem.
Okay, I think I'm muted here. Sorry, I was muted. Pardon me for that. You were then called to be involved with this question or this investigation or compendium on the lessons learned. I think as you're in the field, working there at the embassy or touring around the countryside, already you're starting to see that certain things are going well, others maybe not. When are you starting to focus on lessons learned prior to your returning to the United States to be involved in this written report?
Almost immediately, because it was from I arrived in Afghanistan in 2009. I was brought up to Kabul in 2010, and for the next 5 years until 2014, I was sort of the only person with any real knowledge of the subject matter. And the other issue that is unfortunate with how the U.S. government handles these things, and not just in Afghanistan, is that the diplomats assigned to Kabul were there for 1 year at a time. So there was a constant turnover. There was no memory from one generation of foreign service officers to the next of what conversations had taken place, what decisions had been made, what policies that we had instituted. So I became it. I was the person who was the continuity for 5 years on the corruption issue. And that was very difficult because incoming people all had brilliant ideas that had actually already been tried and failed. So I had to constantly overcome this predisposition to believe in miracles and fairy tales when the situation on the ground in terms of the U.S. contribution to corruption. The Afghan side of the corruption was terrible, but it was largely as a result of what the U.S. was doing there. And to try to get the U.S. to acknowledge the extent, the massive extent of its role in creating the climate of corruption that enveloped the Afghan government. The Afghans were responsible for their part of it. There's no question about that. But we were responsible for ours. And getting our side to acknowledge our responsibility was the hardest part of my job, especially the U.S. military.
There's been some recent attempt in the trade publications like Foreign Affairs, for example, to backtrack a little bit on the question of corruption and the extent to which the United States and the military had some role in that and bear some responsibility. You had some interesting exchanges with the media in 2014. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that. But I'm curious more generally, you know, when is there a moment when the media, the press, are starting to see what's happening in Afghanistan differently, that it's becoming public knowledge, the sorts of things that you're seeing on the ground every day?
I think the media the media are always allies as far as whistleblowers like me are concerned, because the institutions on which we blow the whistle are almost always extremely reluctant to assume responsibility for their shortcomings and for misconduct and wrongdoing. So the whistleblower's main ally in that respect to get the message out is unfortunately not through the so-called internal channels that are designed for that purpose, which always fail, but through the media and elsewhere. But it was what happened in terms of the corruption issue was that even though I was writing reports and others who were working with me were writing reports on the implications of the corruption as it ate away at the functioning of the Afghan government, as it ate away at any kind of popular support for the Afghan government and popular support for the United States, because the Afghans all saw the United States as the major funder of corruption there. They couldn't understand why we weren't more aggressive in stopping it. And so they wondered what our real purpose was in creating this corrupt government, which was failing miserably to deliver the services that we were paying for. And that was nowhere more evident, as far as I'm concerned, than what the US military was doing with the Afghan National Army, which I think was particularly egregious.
Okay, you have been somewhat critical in public fora of the Biden administration's handling of the withdrawal.
Not the withdrawal. Let me stop you there. Anyone who worked in Afghanistan knew it was a disaster. I can't tell you a single person who thought the US should remain in Afghanistan, and I was always advocating, this is a disaster, we should get out. So Biden didn't do anything controversial by withdrawing. There was almost unanimous opinion across everyone who served there. So that was a no-brainer what he did in terms of withdrawal. What we are upset with, all of us who served there, was the horrific way in which it was planned and executed. That is inexcusable for people who were so-called foreign policy expertise, who demonstrated their complete incompetence, I think, in how they handled the evacuation, not the withdrawal. There were only 2,500 troops in there anyway. It was nothing, barely enough to fill, to fill a stadium. Not even fill a stadium, nothing. So that the withdrawal was nothing. It was the evacuation and how that was handled, which was done horrendously. And they knew that it was going to be horrendous, and they didn't do anything about it. They didn't plan for it at all.
Okay, and that's a foreign policy fault, I suppose you would say, or a failing of the foreign policy apparatus. Does it matter that it came so quickly after the transition, a contested and somewhat controversial end to the 2020 presidential election? Are there mitigating circumstances that you could point out? Or is it merely this is something they should have done better, they should have known better, it should have been better planned and executed?
I mean, the behavior of the idiotic previous president Donald Trump is inexcusable. I mean, that's the starting point in setting up this terrible deal with the Taliban and throwing the Afghan people and those who within the Afghan government and within the Afghan community in Kabul and other parts of Afghanistan, we just threw them under the bus. It was like, we don't care what happens to those people. We just want to get out of there. So that was the starting point. And so Biden continued with that policy of withdrawing, but anyone could it was obvious that this was going to be difficult to handle even under the best of circumstances.
Okay.
And the fact is they had better circumstances in April when he announced the decision than at any point thereafter. And they were getting clear indications. I certainly was, and I'm not in the US government. They have the intelligence operations, which clearly failed, predicting that the Afghan government could carry on for the war for 18 to 24 months, which anyone who had worked next to the Afghan military knew was complete farce. And there were NGOs that were actually publishing the creep of the Taliban across the country beginning in February, which was very quick. I mean, it went from 20% control up to 50% control in a matter of months before the collapse.
Okay.
So how is it even conceivable that you could think that the government could last 18 to 24 months? As well as the fact that as late as July the 8th, President Biden said there are 300,000 Afghan military. They should be able to hold the line. There were never 300,000 Afghan soldiers, never. And everyone knew that not only was the maximum number, according to the U.S. military, was 186,000. So that was already 1/3 less than Biden was talking about. But of that 186, about half had deserted or had been wounded. So we're talking about actively available soldiers of probably 100,000 or less, which is about the Taliban. They estimated 70 to 80,000, and so they knew this. The fact is, we were always, the U.S. was always paying up as if there were 300,000 soldiers and equipping 300,000 soldiers with full knowledge for all of these years, that it was much less than that. So there were failures of planners, there were failures of the intelligence, and then to say as a defense, as Biden and company have done, that this is, and Blinken, all of them, this was predictable. This is, chaos was predictable. Well, if chaos is predictable, chaos may be avoidable. If you can see it coming, how about planning for it?
Isn't that what we teach in U.S. foreign policy?
Absolutely. This was like diplomacy 101. This is basic stuff. And the fact that all of these so-called institutionalists who spent decades doing this completely mishandled this from day one. And of course, we have no idea who they took out. I know 40,000 more or less of people who are legitimate immigrants to the United States. But then there are another 60,000, the vast majority. No one really knows what their connection to the United States is or was. And those were taken over the 45 people that I was putting forward, who I documented. And all of the people I know Americans who worked in foreign assistance in the military, who put forward thousands and thousands of names, none of those people got out that way. So who are these people? And then I read that the U.S. military carried out a plane with 44 dogs and 58 people. 44 dogs? And you leave behind hundreds of thousands of at-risk Afghans? This is inexcusable.
Yeah, actually, this is one of the things that struck me, that you are expressed this really poignant concern for the fate of these individuals. You know their names, you know how they assisted you in your work, and how they were, favorably inclined towards the attempts of the U.S. government to help create a viable state in Afghanistan. We at ACT have been really concerned with the plight of students at the American University of Afghanistan, for example. I knew personally the previous dean there some years ago. a Greek guy or a Greek American who spent some time in Kabul. And, you know, you look to see the website is down, and, you know, those are people, there was a lot of American investment in that particular institution. And, you know, wouldn't you have thought that those people would be at risk almost immediately the moment the United States military is evacuated from Afghanistan? And that seems to be what's transpiring now. I mean, are things on the ground in Afghanistan now under the Taliban as bad as some media personalities are making them to be? I mean, how bad is it really there, to your knowledge?
Well, I know of the people that I was, I mean, I'm in touch with many of them, some of them quite frequently. There are, to be fair, of the 50 that Democracy International and I documented and put forward to the State Department, the White House. I mean, we weren't talking, you know, we were talking directly to people in these institutions, the White House and others, and they were very sympathetic. But in the end, of the 50 we put forward, only 3 managed to get out. And just to illustrate how at least one of them got out, he, his wife, and his 6 children spent 4 days and nights in that horrible entrance to the airport, which I have been to in and through dozens of times. When the
so-called international airport,
the Kabul, the Hamid Karzai International Airport. There's one entrance to that airport for everyone, and it was, of course, jammed with thousands of people. That's where the bomb went off that killed. Yes, it killed 13 Americans, which is tragic, or whatever the number is, but it killed, you know, hundreds of Afghans. We know of at least 170 who died. And so he and his wife and their children spent 4 days and nights in the open air in the crowd, trying to get to the front where they could actually show whatever documentation they had. And as fate would have it for them, they were lucky. And one of them, the husband and father who worked for me, showed a Marine his on his phone, his paperwork, basically his application paperwork, nothing from the State Department, and this guy let him in, and that's how they got out. And now I'm happy that they're at a National Guard encampment in rural Indiana. I hear from him that now that the weather is cooling off, there are no blankets and so on for the children. It's getting kind of cold, and there are thousands and thousands of people there, all of whom arrived with almost no notice, and thousands more coming. So that's a whole different story of what's happening on the ground in the United States. But as to your question about what's happening on the ground in Kabul, the ones that I've been in touch with have said that some of them have been beaten. They almost all have Taliban guards outside of their homes. The women in particular are subject to all kinds of harassment. They cannot go out without wearing a burqa now, a full body covering, the one that was you associate with Afghanistan, which covers the body from head to toe, literally. So they've been beaten. If the Taliban can't find them, they beat other members of their family in order to get information as to where they might be. They beat their families in the villages. They're not permitted to leave their homes. Some of them there's no food, so they're getting food any way they can because the shops.
No food and no money, from what we read in the reports.
Food, they're allowed to take out, I believe it's $200 per week, or maybe it's per day, but whatever it is, it's not very much, especially with the prices having skyrocketed for commodities. Although the water system has broken down, as I think the UN has said, Afghanistan is on the verge of a gigantic humanitarian catastrophe as a result of all this. So
in essence, we're going backwards. I mean, it's hard to escape that conclusion, is it not? And you have been there; you know what it was like.
Yes, and I of course, there's a lot of talk about how the Taliban, which was a insurgency, it was a guerrilla movement a large one as it happened, and a successful one. How will they now govern? What's going to be? How are they going to transform themselves from fighters to ministers and ministries and civil servants? That's a huge question. I think what they're hoping for, the Taliban is hoping for, that they can somehow, I wouldn't say entice, but force those who worked for the previous government to return to work, even without pay, so that somehow there's a semblance of government. Obviously, that is a huge question that as to what will actually happen. I'm doubtful that this will. I don't know whether this regime will remain in place for very long if it cannot deliver even basic services that the Afghans are now used to. They're used to relatively good, I mean, by very poor country standards. They're used to health posts within 4.5 hours walk, which is a remarkable achievement by USAID and by other European Union donors, so that healthcare has improved. The life expectancy in Afghanistan has improved dramatically, not as much as the donors claimed, but it has improved. There were schools, not just for boys and girls, and so 8 million. I believe there's a huge number, millions of Afghans have gone through the schooling system there, and people are proud of the fact of their children, boys and girls, being educated. So to have that collapse would raise serious doubts as to the viability of a Taliban-led government among the people.
Okay, let me shift gears here a little bit, if you don't mind. You reside currently in Greece. You have a home here. You have a long connection with Greece. Your children were schooled here in Thessaloniki, and they come back to visit. You have a family home. You're an American who has done much work abroad, an expat, for much of your professional career. I wonder if these assessments that you see internationally about the loss of credibility of the U.S. government have any verity, and whether that impacts you or should impact me somehow. This is what I call the passport question. And it's really, for the last 20 years, I would say maybe, I take a convenient point of departure, the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And then you had the contested outcome of the 2000 presidential election. And then you had the neocon adventure in Iraq. And then you had the Obama administration with the surge, and then the secret spying program and the use of drones. And that was something that I think really impacted the image of the United States abroad. And then you had the 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House with America First. And you had January 6th in the contested election from November 2020. Is our reputation as a country taking a hit here? Can it be corrected? And how does that impact a citizen of the United States like yourself or like me who lives abroad?
I think that the marked deterioration in the way the United States is viewed was Trump, and I'm not saying that because I am anti-Trump. I'm saying that because that's exactly what I experienced during the years that I've been working abroad, which includes the entire period of Trump's term. He, in my work in particular, which is anti-corruption work, when you have a president who is so venal and so incompetent and so much in favor of schemes that are corrupt, then and where there's no accountability for him or any of the people who worked close to him, this seriously damaged the image of the United States. And certainly when it comes to talking about transparency, accountability, effectiveness, the fight against corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse, which is what I do, it became harder because people could point to what was happening in the United States and say, who are you to tell us what to do? Look at the mess your country is under Trump, which was true. But also, then it became more a question of personal integrity and personal reputation. So, the fact that I have been doing this kind of work in very difficult environments for a long time under serious personal risk and threat has afforded me a certain amount of credibility in the environments where I work, which are almost all in one way or another conflict or post-conflict countries, although lately I've been lucky to be working in places which are not like that, but also extremely corrupt. So yes, it has had this deterioration, particularly since 2016, has been marked. I've seen it, I've felt it. It's affected how I conduct myself now abroad.
Okay.
And I think for U.S. citizens, there's much more of a question mark about your abilities, your competence, your commitment to the greater good, because the United States, at least under Trump, has retracted from the role that it had played. No matter how controversial or how flawed it might have been, it did have predictable support for certain principles, at least some of the time. By that I mean democratic governance, et cetera, et cetera. But when that was abandoned under Trump, it became difficult. I think it's proving harder for the new administration to undo that damage than they expected.
Let's think a little bit about the current administration then. I've had a question from the audience, and it has to do with a recent decision now of the Biden administration to equip the Australian Navy with nuclear submarines, if I'm not mistaken. You might understand the equipment side of things. But he seems to have done this without consulting European allies. There was such a concern during the Trump administration that we seem to be giving up on NATO. We know that President Macron is furious, and he canceled a major event in Washington, D.C. as a way of protesting the fact that President Biden didn't consult with any of the allies before making the announcement. Now, I don't know whether that's a question of incompetence or oversight, or you don't need to know, or it's clear that we're shifting from Europe. But, what do you make of this? And, the fact that there was little or no consultation with NATO allies before the withdrawal was announced and it began. There seems to be a gap in what President Biden said as a candidate and what he's doing as president. Do you perceive it this way?
I do. I think, leaving aside the Australia-UK issue, the Europeans are well aware that the U.S. has a Five Eyes agreement with five: Canada, New Zealand, UK, Australia, and U.S. That's an intelligence sharing agreement, and it covers a wide variety of other areas as well. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that this kind of deal would be cut. And I think it might be a little disingenuous on the part of some of the Europeans to be shocked that this is the case. That may be more for domestic consumption than it is really a surprise. Lack of consultation, I don't think I would necessarily believe that that is the case. I mean, everyone has known of the pivot of the United States towards China, not to withdraw from Europe, but that China is a Russia and China are the two greatest threats, China in particular, that the U.S. now faces. The Europeans, unfortunately, because of the nature of their EU mechanisms and in general a certain kind of slowness off the mark when it comes to these things. I know that from direct experience working with them over many years in many countries, that they are very difficult to get them to do anything, even at the highest levels. And I have plenty of firsthand information of very critical incidents in that respect. That even if there had been consultation, let's assume there wasn't any consultation. Why should there have been? Actually, but as a matter of courtesy and a matter of interest, I'm not sure I completely agree with or completely accept that there was no consultation. I think that is unlikely.
Okay, I want to wrap up a little bit, at least with the segment on your experience in Afghanistan. The theme of the program, as we announced it, was how should we feel about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan? Why does it matter? So perhaps you might just conclude by explaining why you think Afghanistan matters. And let's add a little twist here. If you were to go back knowing what you know now, would you have served in Afghanistan as you did?
Those are two very different questions. So why? Let me just cover one other thing that you touched on, which was the U.S. not consulting the allies about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Again, I don't know whether there was consultation or not, but there was no surprise in Biden's announcement on April 28th.
Okay.
And by the way, it's not as if diplomats from the U.S. and these other countries aren't talking about this kind of thing all the time. They are. It's not like everyone lives in a monastery or a cloister and they only come out when the moon's out. These people are in constant contact all the time, and the possibility that this could happen was widely discussed over a long period of time. In fact, most of the allies think this was long overdue, and they had very, very small numbers of troops actually on the ground in Afghanistan. We did too. So this was a decision that was welcomed by the allies across the board. Consultation, I don't know what happened with that. Now, to your other questions, what are the lessons about that we have from Afghanistan? Well, I think they're different for different audiences. I mean, the U.S.
Yes, we seem to have lost the internet connection, but I'll take this opportunity to remind our audience that we're speaking with James Wasserstrom, a diplomat and public official, worked for many years for the United Nations, including at the UN mission in Kosovo, and then at the behest of the US government in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2014. He's currently involved in two major civil society ventures of his own doing, including as the CEO and a founder of the Integrity Sanctuary, which he'll tell us about momentarily. We've got your back, Jim, so I'll ask you to tell us now what the lessons learned are.
Well, the lessons for the U.S. are that I think that they need to, if there's going to be some sort of occupation or war, that the U.S. gets involved in. And this is not new. This goes back to Vietnam. That you need to plan from the moment you get involved. You need to plan for what happens if you end up staying longer than you think, or if you win or lose the war. What happens next?
Okay.
These are never purely military adventures. There are many different sides which have been underestimated and undervalued. And our intelligence community is, I think people have seen too many James Bond movies. And they think of the intelligence community as
No. You weren't there to save the world. They sent you in to do James Bond in Afghanistan.
Yeah. I mean, these are ordinary people who are trying to do bureaucratic jobs.
Okay.
These are not superhumans, and therefore, I wish we had superhumans in these really important positions, but we don't.
Not yet.
Not yet, and they have made the same mistakes over and over and over again. One of which, primarily, is to actually find out what the local people are doing, thinking, and saying about what's going on before we do one of these interventions, and during and after, because it would have changed the entire way we operated in Afghanistan if we had been much better informed about what's really working, what's really necessary. So that's one. There are many others. One country or even a group of countries should not attempt to reconstruct another one on essentially bilateral levels. This is, that's ridiculous, and it has failed almost everywhere. But there are lots of lessons as far as corruption specifically are concerned. Let me just say the one that I think is the most important, which is that it's a matter of realpolitik. The reality on the ground is that we are going to have to do business with some nasty characters. I mean, when I say we, I mean NATO. I mean all of us involved in this.
Not just the United States.
Not just the United States. You have to, and we did with the warlords. And we bought them off to fight the Taliban in the beginning. We bought them off to not fight Hamid Karzai and join that government and soon thereafter. And then we bought them off again to fight the Taliban when they became resurgent some years later. And the problem was that the utility of these guys just joined the government to use it as a vehicle for corruption, nepotism, and cronyism, fraud, waste, and abuse. That's what they did. And we knew that. So we, as an alliance or as a government, should have pulled the plug once their utility to us became zero or negative. And we never did.
Okay.
As far as, so that's one. And that happens across the world in almost every environment where we operate. Well, when we cozy up to some of these, bad guys, the
bad guys are everywhere. They're
everywhere, and we don't recognize them for what the harm that they're doing until it slaps us in the face, and it's obvious much earlier, and we should admit it and move on from those people, abandon them to their fates at the hands of the people or otherwise. And then the second question you asked me:
would you go back if you knew what you know now? Would you go back?
No, I wouldn't go back, because if I had known how insincere the U.S. military and the State Department were about the corruption that ultimately led to the collapse of the entire effort, and which many of us, not just corruption people like me, but lots of people around in Kabul and a small handful in Washington, very small, were screaming in writing. I would brief congressional leaders, Nancy Pelosi, lots of other people, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, senators, how bad things were. But nothing changed. It was sort of, as the military once said to me, it doesn't matter how much we waste as long as we get the job done. That's what they said to me directly at a senior level.
So knowing that, you would think twice at the very least about, now how does it change then the work you're doing now?
It taught me a very important lesson, David.
Yeah,
which is that I will never work with anyone in the fight against corruption who I think is not serious about it. I work at very high political levels now, and I will not, and I've made it very clear that I will not take on any work with people who I think are part of the problem and posing as part of the solution.
Okay, excellent. Jim, what a pleasure it is to have you here. I will take this opportunity to reveal that you've actually spoken twice under the auspices of the Dukakis Center. Once in 2010 when you were already in Afghanistan, and it didn't dawn on me at the time. You kept, mentioning Afghanistan. Well, what is he doing in Afghanistan? We were talking about Kosovo all the way back then. And then we did a landmark conference 2 years ago with Transparency International Greece and my dear friend Anna Damascu on whistleblowing in Greece and abroad. And you were our keynote speaker, and you gave us the full story of what transpired at UNMIK and how your career was almost deliberately destroyed and how you sought to rebound from that. So there you are, we're neighbors, and for anyone who's watching the program and has any questions or would like to somehow get in touch with you, you can email me at the Dukakis Center, and that's dukakis-center@act.edu. I'm David Wisner, the executive director of the center, and I'll forward anything that I receive directly to Jim. We will certainly look forward to having you on a future program to talk about your experience in Ukraine or throughout Southeast Europe, or whatever new assignments come your way. You've worked in North Africa, if I understand correctly. You're a well-traveled diplomat, and I'm sure you have enough stories to fill a book, if not more. I want to draw the attention of our audience to what we're doing at the Dukakis Center. Our mission is to seek to instill a spirit of, what we call public spirit in the Anglo-Saxon world, and which is in evidence really among young people. If they don't know what it is, we help them articulate how they want to contribute to the well-being of society, their fellow citizens in their various communities. It could be the Greeks, and not only the Greeks, but the foreign students, the many American students we have as study abroad students at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki. So that is our mission, and we take as a role model Michael Dukakis himself, the 3-term governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the 1988 Democratic nominee for president in the United States. Michael and Kitty Dukakis have both visited ACT in Thessaloniki on several occasions since we inaugurated the Dukakis Chair and Center in September 1999. That is the role of the Dukakis Center, and we do it in part by having guests like James Wasserstrom come and talk about their experience. They serve as role models in a way. A person of such incredible integrity as Jim Wasserstrom, you're not going to meet every day. And the stories about the corrupt environments in which he's worked are enough to get the hair on your neck to rise. But to seek that there are people who try to live an ethos of public service and public spiritedness. Behind me, you'll see a banner, and it's a reminder that coming up at the end of this semester, or I think really it'll be after the new year, we'll host the 4th annual Thessaloniki Think Tank and Civil Society Forum, in which we gather representatives of local think tanks, research institutes, various civil society organizations, and we try to inform the public what these different organizations are up to in Thessaloniki, throughout Greece and abroad, but also to seek to inspire young people who think maybe they'd like to do an internship or explore the prospect of a career in public service and civil society. So that's coming. That'll probably be the last event of the current fall 2021 semester at ACT. We're going to launch an exhibition, a virtual exhibition of posters and banners like the one behind me, which we've designed and created since 2011 for the past 10 years for the various events and activities that we've organized and hosted at the Dukakis Center. And we will be here with Pandelis Savidis on the Aniknevsis Web TV channel monthly towards the middle of the month for the next several months, probably right up until May or June of 2022. So I take my leave. I'm David Wisner, and I'm glad that we've been able to speak with you this evening and to host our dear friend, James Wasserstrom. Good night.
Thank you, David. Good night.